the self and the senses and prana for vital force. Those who would know the self by knowledge cease to regard the senses as the measure of reality and of the self. This non-sensory knowledge reveals the self's freedom from the senses and sets one free of the limitations of the senses. Those who know that there is neither permanence of the senses nor happiness through them, who do not equate pleasure with happiness or pain with sorrow, but recognize that happiness and sorrow are determined by knowledge of the self and ignorance respectively, and who desire to experience the spiritual truth beyond the senses, take resource to the inquiry to know the self. By such inquiry, the knowledge that the self is immediately transcended of the senses and not bound by the senses in any manner shines. The knowledge of the self itself is itself free from the limitations of the senses, as is the self itself. And those who abide in this knowledge remain unmoved by whatever happens to the senses. By the knowledge of the self, which is the knowledge of reality, one brings about the destruction of the foundations of the delusion of believing in the existence of an external world. The wise yogi knows that the senses do not and cannot provide happiness. That attachment to the senses or their objects is bondage. That the senses are neither bliss nor immortal, and that the purpose of life is not fulfilled by any kind of sensory experience. Such a one knows that liberation is not any kind of experience. Such a one knows that liberation is not any kind of sensory experience, and that the realization is not a particular kind of sensation, not an increase of sensation, and not a decrease of sensation, One's freedom from the senses must be firm and natural for there to be realization. This necessitates the knowledge of the self, transcendence of the senses. The self is infinite consciousness, unchanging being, perfectly full bliss, vast and space-like, formless and unconditioned. It is of immense silence, peace, ever shining and motionless. It is within it, without actually occurring. There is imagined the realm of objective experience, manifesting as the world perceived by the five senses. There appear five kinds of senses with their corresponding kinds of sense objects. Within the realm of the senses, a great variety of sensations and an apparently uncountable number of sense objects arise. These are the sense experiences of living beings, which are differentiated from one another by means of misidentification with the body, like the surface, ripples, and foam on the waves in the ocean of consciousness, like clouds in the sky of pure being are the senses. The self is being consciousness. To confound the self with any or all of the senses in any way is ignorance. Freedom from misidentification with the senses is knowledge. Since knowledge is liberation, and since one seeks to know reality and not create it, for it always is. Therefore, one should discern clearly the self, its innate freedom from the senses, and its freedom from all the limitations of the senses. The self is singular and indivisible existence. The senses are multiple and divided. The senses themselves are objective, the known, just as the sense objects are. The self is non-objective, ever the knower of the nature of existence consciousness. So how can the senses be considered to be the self? The self is changeless, continuous, permanent existence. The senses are changeful, discontinuous, and impermanent. The senses are lost, dulled, or altered in death, old age, and illness. The senses change during the lifetime, from infancy until the end of the body. The senses are changing all the time, transforming into dull and acute states, subject as they are to the three gunas, the qualities of tamas, inertia, rajas, agitation, sattva, tending towards the light of knowledge. Each sense takes a turn being predominant and fades due to a change of the sense organ, the mental attention, and similar factors. The senses appear only in the waking state. With each state of mind, they change. Upon the death of the body, which is not the self, the senses are lost entirely. Rarely are all the five senses active or experienced simultaneously, but existence is always wholly present. The senses are just a momentary function. The self is steady, self-existent reality, permanent, and not a function of some other thing. It is being, and not doing or activity. The self is not determined by any conditions and is itself without any conditions whatsoever. The senses, though, are determined by conditions such as the condition of the sense organ, the environment, the experience of which is the result of the interaction of what appears to have become split in consciousness. That is, the object and the instrument used to know it, and the mental attention given to or removed from the senses. From a higher view, in the one mind, all three mutable factors appear, determining the five sense experiences. Partless existence, which is the self, is beyond the changeful appearances in the mind. So how can the sense thus be considered to be the self? The senses are part of the body. The body is perceived only by the senses and has no reality apart from them. Each illusion depends on the other. Such illusion is like the painting of a wall that is painted on the wall, depicted when the wall itself has not yet been built. The self is bodiless and is not a part of the body or associated with a location in relation to a body, unlike the senses. So, how can the senses be considered to be the self? The senses depend on the self. The self exists as it is, innately non-dependent on the senses. This is the highest state of detachment. As pure being, one is always already detached from the senses, and thus to the world. The self is not the senses and is not experienced by the senses. The senses are capable of perceiving sense objects only, and the self is not a material object. The sensory experience is only that of sensation and not of separate sense and objects. The self is not a sensation or a product of sensations. So, how can the senses be considered to be the self? The self is the eye of the eye, when seen by the eye. This self, which is formless being consciousness, cannot be sensed and does not have senses. It is not a sensing entity, conceived as a nexus of all the sensations, but ever unalloyed consciousness. The self is all-seeing, but eyeless. In truth, the senses do not exist. They are only a figment of the mind, which is in the infinite consciousness. Upon the substrate of the self, which is being consciousness, the senses, which are but the thought of them, appear. The sense objects do not separately exist, but appear only to and in the senses. The senses vanish, leaving the substrate unaffected and all alone. The substrate is reality, which is immutable. There is no actual creation of the senses in their consciousness. By this knowledge, one remains identified as the self and not misidentified with the senses, which are unreal. Let there be this steady knowledge. May the unsensed knowledge of the self, free of all the limitations of the senses, abide. Those who yearn to go beyond the illusory boundary of life and death, who desire to be beyond the limitations of life, and who do not wish to suffer death, clearly discriminate between existence or consciousness and prana or life energy. Prana signifies the life energy, that which seems to animate the body and the senses, without which they are inert. Prana, in various combinations with the body, senses, and the mind, is that which is responsible for the experiences called physical and subtle. Without such animating energy, there is no bodily or sensory experience. For a corpse has no experience, and its sense organs, though intact, are not animated and do not produce any experience. The result of inquiry to know the self is abidance as pure being consciousness, which transcends the animate and the inanimate, and which never dies. And this is abidance in the invariable state of the self. As long as one is identified with the prana, there will be the differentiation of living and death, and to one being, whichever is, will appear veiled. And this misidentification is destroyed through knowledge. This duality vanishes. Prana undergoes fluctuations from birth to death, in health and sickness, and varies according to lifestyle and activities. Being does not fluctuate. So how could prana be equated with the self? The animated prana is objective. It is something experienced and not the consciousness that knows it. It is not being arrived that enables one to be conscious, but consciousness that knows the state of being alive. So how could prana be equated with the self? The life energy seems to locate itself throughout the body. The self is not located in a body or spatially in any manner. So how could prana be equated with the self? The prana functions animating the body and the senses in various ways. The self, which is consciousness, remains as it witness. The self is the immovable reality of existence, and not a function. So how could prana be equated with the self? The prana does not remain eternally as it manifests, but at some time it is absorbed. It may be said to be absorbed into the great universal prana, which in turn is absorbed in the absolute. It may be said to be absorbed in the mind, which in turn is absorbed in the absolute. The self is itself the absolute, and is never absorbed into anything. That which actually exists always is. That which can be absorbed, or which has a beginning and an end, is an unreal appearance. It ultimately does not exist. The self exists, and there is nothing else into which it can be absorbed. So how could prana be equated with the self? The prana depends upon the self. The self does not depend upon the prana. There are ways, such as those known by some yogis, to alter the prana or its functions. The self is an unalterable being and immutable. One cannot modify being, and one cannot stand apart from the being to attempt to modify it. If so, how could prana be equated with the self? The life energy is ultimately transient, whether viewed as one's individual bodily life energy or as all the manifest life energy. The self is that which is eternal. There is no time when one begins or ceases to exist. This self, which is absolute being, ever is as it is. So how can prana be equated with the self? Therefore, the self is not to be identified with the prana, the life energy, and does not bear the prana as an attribute. The self is free of prana, and all that manifests due to prana. May there be this unwavering knowledge. May there be this immortal knowledge of the timeless self and liberation from the illusions of life and death. May this eternal realization be. Reality and the world. In as much as the view of the world is a mirror image of the view of oneself, as the identity of oneself determines the definition of the world, and as the seer himself appears as the seen, the I as this, for the purpose of knowing reality without feels. One should inquire to know oneself, giving up the objective outlook, as well as the ego to whom it belongs. Those who are detached from the world and the senses, who are not identified with the body, who perceive the transient nature of all in the world, and who yearn for the direct experience of the knowledge of reality as it is, should so inquire. A wise yogi views the world as transitory, as inert, and as a passing dream. Such a one never expects the world to provide him with what is his happiness, identity and reality. To transcend it is to remain blissful, at peace always, and free in the knowledge of the unreality of the world and the soul's freedom from that illusion. This is the perception of reality free of the forms of illusion. A widest in world as being, true perception, transcendence of the world, limitless freedom, unaffected by anything of the world. Direct experience of indivisible existence and true experience beyond debate or doubt are for those who inquire to know the self, which is the sole existent reality. By the term world is meant all that is perceived, all objects, all activities, all events, the forms of living beings, anything in space and time, and anything seen, heard, touched, or sensed in any manner, Transcendence of the world is liberation from bondage and suffering in relation to all of this. Abandonment of the objective outlook constituting the world yields the perception of reality as it is. Such cannot be by anything of the world, but only by knowledge of the self, the reality that is. Where could one go in the world that one would be beyond the world, yet one's real being is ever beyond the world, and knowledge reveals its nature. The self is changeless and permanent. The world is changeful and impermanent. Each object has a creation, a changeful duration, and a destruction. This is true for all objects and for the world as a whole, without exception. The self is permanent with no creation or destruction. The perception of the world depends on the changeful senses. A change in the senses brings a change in the object, the world perceived. The self does not change as the senses do, for it is an immutable being and the unchanging witness of all the changing senses. A change of mode or state of mind yields a corresponding change in the senses and the perceived world. The self is not changed, being immutable existence and consciousness, and the witness of the mind as well as the senses. The self is one, wordless, and indivisible. The world is composed of innumerable parts and divisions. The self has no form, and is purely formless being. The world is composed of forms, without which there is no world. There is no formless world. The existence of the self is not sensorially perceived, but is known more interiorly. The world is perceived only through the senses. The self is ever the subject, the knower. The world is only the object, the known. Therefore, the self has no connection with the world, as the self shares none of its characteristics or qualities. It is not defined by the world or worldly things. It is not bound by the world or anything of the world. It does not depend on the world in any way in order to be. That which is true of the being and consciousness of the self It's also true of the bliss of the self. These three not being actually three, but one and the same thing. This discernment yields freedom from the illusory bondage when the world is apparently perceived, as well as when it is not so. By such knowledge, one realizes that the self is not of the world and is not in the world. The self is not produced by anything of the world. It shares none of its limited qualities and is not an object within it. For the self is neither a body nor located in a body. Entertaining and debating various concepts or opinions regarding the world can be only so long as there is no clear discernment of the one who perceives the world. Once there is deeper knowledge regarding the self, the questions about the world's nature no longer arise. The realization of the unborn is the realization of no creation. In the absence of this knowledge, there may arise confusion such as, if it is unreal, why does it appear? If it is unreal, why does it not disappear? The confusion is rooted in the delusive supposition that the mere senses are the determination of reality, and the knower is conceived as a sensory being engaged in an experience that is of the same nature as himself. A deep inquiry into the nature of the knower himself will result in an absence of a defined separate experiencer and thus of the world as supposedly experienced. This yields the revelation of the one infinite existence of the self. The meaning of all is the self, or all is Brahman, is comprehended in this non-dual knowledge without a trace of anything other. To experience a world is to conceive it. The world is not actually a perception, but a conception. To conceive or experience a world, one must first consider oneself as some kind of body, or as in the body as existent and the body as being somewhere. It is not the truth, for such is only imagined in the mind. For this illusion of the world, one must also regard the sensations not as sensations from also mind, but as endowed with the duality of inner and outer, with the apparent object portion of the sensation considered as separate from the knowing aspect, since the body is not oneself, and the self is not in a body, the world is not around oneself. Around is imagined within the mind and is not all around. The world is constituted solely of sense perceptions, usually from a supposed bodily location. There is no world apart from these, so the world is not external. The external is merely a conceptual interpretation of the sensations. The senses are known only by and in consciousness. So what is thought of as external is entirely in consciousness, which is free from the senses. The external world is a mere notion in consciousness. Within the notion appears the whole external world. It is one notion fragmented into the imagining of endless objects that are seen to exist. The one notion depends on the false I am the body belief. The world is a mere notion, an illusory appearance in one's own mind. Therefore, it is called Maya, illusion. Illusion is that which is not. Since the world is unreal, it can offer no bondage. Being unreal, it does not actually come to be. It is for this reason that Maya is said to be beginningless. The reality does not bring forth the unreal. Being non-dual, the reality does not bring forth anything real. Ever-existent being, itself inborn, creates not at all. The unreal is also not born, for it does not exist. Being unreal, it does not disappear, any more than the dream world disappears for the dream character when one awakes from both. The world appears in consciousness alone. It is known by the knower. It is known in the knower. It has no existence apart from the knower, which is pure consciousness. The world appears in consciousness by the power of consciousness. It's composed of consciousness and is known or experienced by consciousness. All of it is just consciousness. It has not the least degree of any other existence. One being consciousness exists everywhere, always. The one self experiences itself everywhere, always. It itself is just thought of as a world, though there is really no such differentiated thing. Consciousness is the world, space, time, matter, motion, and events, the moments and the eons, things and people, the animate and the inanimate, the moving and the still, the large and the small, the living and the dead, the far and the near, the atoms and the galaxies, the root and the flower, the cause and the effect, and all else. To oneself is all. To oneself appears as all this universe. The universe appears in the self. The self, being formless and infinite, does not appear in it. The self appears as the universe, but really undergoes no modifications. It always abides as the perfectly full void of being. If the world appears, it and its knower are only the self. If there is no appearance, there is only the self. In the knowledge of the unalterable, ever same reality, the self alone is. Thus, in reality, there is no question of a world ever being created or ever appearing. For whom will it appear? As there is no second self, but only the one self ever. The self is the seer of the world. The world does not see the self. Existence is consciousness, and the self is that. There is no existence apart from consciousness. The self, realizing the truth of the self, one sees that there is no world. It is not that. The seer of truth does not see the world as if this knowledge were a sensory state, but rather the seer of truth sees that there is no world. The seer of truth is the self, and the self is indivisible, non-objective, without exterior, undifferentiated, and one without a second. Consciousness, infinite and undivided, sees none but itself. That which is not consciousness does not see at all. Lacking being, it also lacks knowing. As the self, one does not see the world, and the world does not see oneself. In non-duality, being alone is real. The world has never come to be. So it is said to be completely unreal. The world never was, is not, and never will be. The uncreated, unmodified, worldless absolute alone is. That alone is, and that you are. The real ever is, and the unreal has never come to be. The conclusion about this is known by the knowers of truth. May this indestructible knowledge abide always. May this non-objective, formless knowledge be. May that knowledge in which reality comprehends itself be.